and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to the 25th annual Alex Darling lecture. The lecture was established in 1998 in honor of Alexander Darling, professor of history and political science here at Stanford, and a founder of Russian, East European, and Eurasian studies here, and also the director of the center twice in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. Alex was one of the rare scholars who navigated smoothly between history, political science, and current events. He made his name in the seminal study of German occupation policies in the Soviet Union, followed by numerous studies on Soviet diplomacy, the Comintern, the correspondence between Stalin and Dimitrov, and other studies on the downing of the Korean airplane in 1983 and the Gorbachev reforms. All along, Alex played a prominent role in promoting Slavic studies in the country. He served as the president of the Association for Advancement of Slavic Studies and was the chair of the National Council of East European and Soviet Research. He also played a major role in bringing Soviet and post-Soviet scholars here to Stanford, where they could work on their PhDs. And finally, last but not least, he was instrumental in the establishment of the European University in St. Petersburg. It is my honor today to introduce our speaker, but first, before we do that, I would like to also introduce Gay Lapidus, Alex's widow, who is here with us, and David Holloway, the successor of Alex, who was the Spruance chair here at Stanford. This year's speaker is Andrei Soldatov, an eminent investigative journalist from Russia, the co-founder and editor of Agentura.ru, the watchdog of the Soviet, the post-Soviet, the Russian security services, and now a senior fellow in CIPA, the Center for European Policy Analysis. Andrei is also the co-author, along with his partner, Irina Borogan, of several important studies on the restoration of the security services in post-Soviet Russia, the new nobility, Red Web, on the Kremlin's war on the internet, and finally, compatriots on Russian exiles in opposition to the Kremlin. Regrettably, his world fame brought him also an honorary place in the wanted list of the security services in Russia. He's on the wanted list and basically a refugee now in Europe, but we are honored to have him. Today, he will talk about the inside politics of the Russian invasion with a focus on Putin's personality and the role of the security services. Please join me in welcoming Andrei.
Thank you, Amir, for a very kind introduction, and thank you everybody for having me, for inviting me. It's a true honor for me to be here. It's my first time in this place, and it is important for me. First thing first, I wanted to address the question which some people in this audience might be asking themselves. Is why listen to the Russians after such a horrible year, after Mariupol and Bucha and massive air strikes on civilian infrastructure in Ukraine? And it is a very good and legitimate question. After all, Russian liberals represent a lost cause. We lost, and now we are minority. There's no way to deny that. But I strongly believe that sometimes the minority could make the change. And the Russian history, especially the modern Russian history, is probably a good case study of exactly that. I also believe that Russians should speak out because it is our way to undermine Putin's narrative that he has the entire country behind him in this war, which he doesn't. Okay, so let me walk you through what I'm going to talk about today. We'll start with a bit of history. How comes the FSB, out of all Russian intelligence agencies, became responsible for Ukraine? Second, we will explore why the FSB made such a bold mistake in assessing the political situation in Ukraine before the invasion, completely underestimating the resistance of the Ukrainians. And after that, we will talk about how the war affected Russian security services. So what the services did to the country during this year, and what the Kremlin did to the services in 2022. So first, how comes the FSB, the domestic agency, which is primarily responsible for counterintelligence, counterterrorism, for suppressing political dissent in the country, how this agency became responsible for Ukraine in the eyes of Vladimir Putin? Let me tell you a story. The year was 2002, it was June, and back then I was the head of the department in a weekly newspaper called Versia. Versia had an office in the Star-Arbat district, actually next door to the residence of the US ambassador, Spasa House, and it had a rather scandalous reputation. We did have naked women on the last page of our paper. But at least my editor never censored me or my journalist. And our main job was to write about the Russian security services. In the summer 2002, it was still possible, there was still some space to do that. It was closing, as we all get to learn, just in 4 months, but it was still there. So one day in June, I got a letter. It was addressed to me, and it was a physical letter in a white envelope with no signature. It has a very short note, and I'm citing. According to the law on the FSB, one of the main jobs of the FSB is to conduct intelligence activities, Article 8. According to the decree of the President of the Russian Federation of 1999, the external intelligence bodies of the FSB of Russia were set up for these purposes. The anonymous author added, "This sounds like nonsense, but in fact, it is the usual competition between intelligence services within the country and abroad." My informer provided the name of this new department. It was the Operational Information Coordination Directorate of the FSB. I was puzzled because Russia already had 2 foreign intelligence bodies, successors to our Soviet predecessors, as military intelligence, and the SVR, the direct descendant of the first chief directorate of the KGB. So why create a new agency within the FSB? The reason my informer claimed was deeply rooted in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. In the early 1990s, Russia's security services wanted to have special relationships with the former Soviet republics and their security services. So in April 1992, the SVR signed an agreement with its counterparts in these countries. And that back then included Ukraine, Georgia, Belarus, Central Asian states, agreeing not to spy on each other. But the FSB never signed any such agreement and felt completely free from any such obligations. I asked for comments at FSB, and the FSB surprisingly didn't deny what was in the letter. I was very excited. Well, I discovered a new foreign intelligence agency in my country, published the story, and forgot about it. Because there were more pressing issues back then in Russia. 4 months later, we got a huge terrorist attack in Moscow. A theater on Dubrovka was taken hostage by terrorists. More than 1,000 people were taken hostages, and the special operation by the FSB was a complete disaster. Lots of people died. Many journalists were extremely critical of the operation, including us, and the FSB was extremely unhappy. So one day they raided the offices of my newspaper, took my computer and the computers of my friends and colleagues, and started interrogating me. And that was when I actually, the first time, visited the Lefortovo prison, which was a very unpleasant experience. Well, to be honest, even before this attack, it was not a very rosy period for Russian journalists. NTV was already crushed, and independent coverage of the Second Chechen War was completely suppressed. But after Nordost, it became really bad. It was a very sad story, and for many years, many of my colleagues and me were forced to switch jobs almost every year, wandering from one troubled newspaper to another. 6 years later, in October 2008, I was a reporter in Novaya Gazeta, one of the last truly independent newspapers in the country. The mood was not extremely cheerful. It was almost literally 2 years after our friend and colleague Anna Politkovskaya was killed, and she had office just down the hall. I was part of the investigative department. We had our own investigation, and to be honest, we failed to find the mastermind who ordered her assassination. And one day in October, I got a visitor. And this visitor was from the FSB. But he came not to raid our offices, but he came to talk to me. He was in his 50s, well, simple manners, modest dress, but he had the rank of colonel. He was not just a colonel, but a colonel in the Foreign Intelligence branch of the FSB. Well, thanks to 8 years of reporting about the security services, I knew quite a lot of people inside. So I knew some generals, some counterterrorism experts, obviously, special forces types, some experts on bomb disposal, obviously interrogators. But I never met an FSB foreign spy before. And he was ready to talk. What he told me was quite astonishing. He told me that since my story was published in 2002, his department went through a really dramatic change. And not because of some bureaucratic struggles, but because of what was going on in the country's neighboring Russia. And I just wanted to remind you that in the early 2000s, a series of popular uprisings started toppling the regimes, and they became known as the color revolutions. So we got the revolution in Georgia in 2003, the Rose Revolution, then the Orange Revolution in Ukraine 2004, the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan 2005. And with every revolution, Putin grew more and more paranoid. On the surface, it was all about geopolitics. Well, Russia's sphere of influence was under threat, but actually it reflected an acute feeling of insecurity shared by many in the security services, and apparently by Putin himself. Where did it come from? The explanation is that Russia went through two very difficult periods in the 20th century alone, two revolutions, 1917 and 1991. And from the FSB perspective, these tragic events happened without understandable reasons. From their perspective, in 1917, the mighty Russian Empire, with the most powerful secret police of that time, Tsar Sakharov, was destroyed for mysterious, unclear reason. Why it was unclear for the FSB? Well, because in our Soviet schools, we were never properly taught the history of the First World War. And that is why it's not part of the school history course that not one but 4 empires were destroyed because of the First World War. In our history, it's all about the revolution and the civil war. In 1991, another Russian empire, now the Soviet Union, was destroyed, and again for the security services. It looked like something which was really difficult to explain. And we know why. Because psychologically it was quite difficult for them to admit that the most intelligent and powerful secret service in the world, as they proudly called the KGB, just failed to protect the communist regime and the Soviet Union. So instead of real reasons, they came up with some mysterious explanations. And that resulted in the concept that the next revolution might start from literally nothing. Like the country is so fragile, this logic goes, that any dissent, even if it's about 5 students protesting on the empty street, might start the collapse of the country, because who knows? And the security services watching the color revolutions believed that the treacherous West came up with a new subversive political technology, and they are getting close. So today it's Kiev and tomorrow it's Moscow. That was the feeling in the FSB. And it was that moment when Putin changed the agenda for the foreign intelligence branch of the FSB. We all, in our Soviet schools, we were taught about the reactionary Tsar Nicholas I and why he was nicknamed Gendarme d'Europe, policeman of Europe. But now Putin decided to create his own policeman, not of Europe, but of the post-Soviet space. And I'm using this terminology because it's been used by the FSB. So the department my colonel was part of was given a task to help the regimes loyal to Putin to stay in power, essentially to help them prevent any political change if it was not sanctioned by Moscow. The foreign intelligence branch of the FSB was made into a full department. Now it was called the Department of Operative Information, and got a new head, Sergei Beseda, an extremely well-connected FSB general with lots of friends in the administration of the president. And of course, this objective was very far from what we can call traditional espionage. And soon, officers of this department were spotted traveling to Belarus, Moldova, Abkhazia, and of course Ukraine. And they act not so much like spies, but like political actors. What they did, they interfered in the local elections. Fast track to 2010. It was June again, and I received a new letter. And this time it was an email. It was not signed, and it had a very short announcement that there is a new website launched by FSB officers with lots of sensitive documents. The website was called danskapravda.com, which you can translate as Truthful Zolubanka. And it contained a trove of really sensitive documents, mostly reports of operations conducted by the FSB addressed to Putin personally. Some of these reports were completely astonishing. For instance, they reported to Putin personally how they spied on the CBS crew which came to Moscow to make a documentary about Nordost. But there were some other reports, and these reports were signed by Sergei Beseda, and they detailed the operations his department conducted in Ukraine. To give you one example, one report described how the department forged a document of the Ukrainian security service suggesting Kiev had funded the opposition in Turkmenistan. The department then leaked the document to Ukrainian media, and the goal was to undermine the relationship between Ukraine and Turkmenistan, and was all about gas. The interesting thing is that the SVR, another Russian intelligence agency, which was also active in Ukraine, picked up this document and reported it as authentic to Putin. So Sergei Besieda added a small note to his report. Vladimir Vladimirovich, please tell our colleagues that actually we made up this document, and I'm sure he was extremely pleased with himself. Fast track to 2014. By that year, the department was made into the 5th service of the FSB, so he got an elevated status. Sergei Besieda was still the head of his service, and he was, well, considered by many as deputy director of the FSB. And he was sent to Kiev to essentially save Yanukovych. He failed, as we all know. Moreover, his presence was exposed by the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry, and the FSB was forced to admit that Besieda was in Kiev to check the security of the Russian embassy. And since 2014, Besieda has been on the US and EU sanctions list. But this failure didn't affect Besieda's career, and his 5th service get only more and more aggressive and ambitious. In Russia, we have this strange thing that the military and security services are quite obsessed with insignia. So we all know that the Red Army had its red stars and the KGB, its swords and shield. Putin's security services reinvented completely the heraldry, and every unit of the FSB got a coat of arms. Most of them were quite straightforward. So a dragon pierced by a spear, that was for the department in charge of suppressing political opposition. A keyhole, that's for a unit conducting surveillance, and so on. When researching our last book's compatriots, we discovered that the 5th service of Besieda had adopted the globe as a symbol. The same image of world encompassing reach used by the SVR. And after that, we understood that Besieda's agents became attached to more and more Russian embassies. And now we are in 2022, and Putin's preparing for the invasion, and he is briefed by the FSB's 5th service. So why the FSB made such a bold mistake assessing the political situation in Ukraine? Well, again, we need to understand the way these people are trained. The KGB officers were trained to think that every person was driven by only base and inferior motives. So dealing with Soviet dissidents, for instance, they looked for money, or dirty family secrets, or madness, as they just couldn't accept for a second that someone could challenge the political system simply because they believed in their cause. And this kind of training has never changed. The FSB officers trained very much the same way. So when the FSB is tasked to assess a political situation, political crisis, they always start with the leaders and with the bureaucracy, looking for weaknesses. And they completely disregard the society and grassroots movements, since they believe that there is no such a thing as a spontaneous civic activity. There should be some actor behind it, say the West or more specifically CIA. And this approach might be quite effective if you are dealing with a country where you have the local regime suppressing the society completely, and you have only a dictator and his generals. But it completely fails when you are dealing with a country with a vibrant and active society. The FSB made bad mistakes several times. When you had protests in Moscow in 2011 and 2012, the FSB failed to identify an organization behind the people on the streets, because there was not such an organization and there was no leader, and Navalny spent most of the time in jail. And the FSB got completely confused. So they blamed social media, and of course the US department. They believed it was truly behind it. The FSB made the same mistake in 2014 in Kiev. Besieda was there, his people were there, but they completely misread the protesters on the Maidan Square. Again, an intelligence mistake. In 2022, the FSB made this mistake again. what they saw in Ukraine and what they reported to Putin was that the country's bureaucracy was prone to corruption. Thus, the logic went, Ukraine was nothing but a failed state. The FSB simply didn't take into account the Ukrainian society, which just didn't want to be invaded. And you might have a question. Why Putin, not really a stupid guy, let it happen time and again, so many times? Well, again, part of the reason is the history of the KGB. Inside of the KGB, there was always a huge disparity between what they called operatives and analysts. The KGB's analysis was never really strong, and the KGB was built this way. Why? Because Soviet leaders and Soviet bureaucracy after Stalin, they didn't want to repeat the Great Purges, and they feared that the KGB might become too powerful. So the KGB didn't have its own analytical department until 1989, just 2 years before the Soviet Union collapsed. So how they did their analysis? And a lot of political analysis was done not in the KGB, but by a small group of experts around the Soviet leader. Most of these people were civilians. And Putin, a big fan of Andropov, trusted the Fifth Service as operatives. He read their reports about the operations they conducted, but he never respected their judgment and their assessments, especially when these analyses concerned the questions he felt emotional about. And we all know that Putin considers himself a big expert on Ukraine. He authored this extremely long article about Ukraine in July 2021. So now add to that the climate of selective repressions Putin started in 2015, 2016, after the annexation of Crimea, when he started targeting his own elites. And that is why we got governors in jail, ministers in jail, and also the FSB generals and colonels ended up in jail. At the same time, they suffered a loss of status. They were stripped of right to have a property abroad, and they couldn't travel abroad. And of course, when you think of the climate which was quite omnipresent in Moscow in 2020, 2021, and you think of an FSB officer, you might think that actually all of that doesn't encourage an honest intelligence assessment. You would really think twice before challenging Putin's opinion about something he really cares. Now let's talk about how the war affected Russian security services. The intelligence disaster in 2022 was so big that Putin couldn't ignore it. Sergei Beseda was placed under house arrest, and soon my sources told me that he was transferred secretly to the Lefortovo prison. As I already mentioned, I visited the Lefortovo prison several times when I was interrogated, and it was never a pleasant experience. It is a fortress, essentially under control of the FSB. Under Stalin, they killed people there in the basement. The FSB under Putin turned the basement into a shooting range. Bellingcat, a digital investigative group, independently confirmed that dozens of officers of the Fifth Service had their phones turned off, indicating that a substantial number of the FSB officers were arrested. There were repressions in other agencies too. For instance, Roman Gavrilov, a deputy head of the National Guard, was forced to resign and reportedly arrested. There were several arrests of high-placed people in the Interior Ministry, including a personal advisor to the Interior Minister. But in the summer, something changed. The repression stopped. Beseda was taken from the photo back to his Lubyanka's office. And it was a very dramatic move. Last time we saw something like that under Stalin. In January, Beseda was paraded at a public event in Moscow to prove the point that nothing ever happened to him. Moreover, his son, Alexander, was made the head of the department at the government overseeing Siloviki, meaning the secret services and the military. And it is a very powerful position. These days, he's invited to attend the meetings of the so-called Coordination Council on Military Supplies, and it is a very powerful body overseeing military supplies to the army fighting in Ukraine. I have only one explanation why. Apparently, Putin came to think that he had no choice but to wage the war with what tools he had at his disposal. And that means the FSB. And now the FSB is on the forefront of this war. Almost every branch of the agency now is involved in the war effort. So now, running the new crackdowns in Russia are the FSB's counterterrorism unit, its counterintelligence service and its investigative department. FSB's special forces and the military counterintelligence branch are running operations targeting Ukrainian civilians and service people in the occupied territories and beyond. The operative search department, the kind of criminal investigation unit within the FSB, is in charge of thwarting Ukraine's sabotage operations. FSB's border troops are processing Ukrainian refugees and harassing Russian men trying to flee the country, and they are also harassing foreign journalists. Even the Economic Security Service of the FSB, which used to be considered the most corrupt part of the FSB, is now enforcing the so-called import substitution. It's a Russian economic policy to survive the Western sanctions. And everywhere, in regional departments and at the Lubyanka Square, at the FSB headquarters, the FSB rank and file feel really angry because just like in the 1990s with Chechnya, now they are again sent for 3-month tours of duty in the occupied territories. And they don't like it because they can get killed and sent again if they are not killed. This shift has profound implications. Before the war, the FSB's main point of reference was the KGB of the 1970s and the 1980s. That's, for instance, how the cult of Yuri Andropov came along. But now the FSB started invoking the practices of something much sinister, Stalin's secret police. Even in public, it became fashionable to refer to SMERSH, which it is a military counterintelligence agency which existed in 1943-1946. And SMERSH was an agency notorious for its brutality. Probably this is the reason why in Jan Fleming's books, it's actually the main enemy of James Bond. It also became quite okay to talk about the NKVD, and this agency had conducted the Great Purges of the 1930s. It became okay to mention some practices used by the NKVD. For instance, the so-called Chekist army operations. And actually these operations were targeted the Ingush and Chechens and Tatars in Crimea when they moved the entire people out of the places they lived. Unfortunately, it makes sense from the FSB's perspective. Why? Well, Stalin's secret services were essentially wartime agencies, even when there was officially no big war. And the war was in the nature of Stalin's regime. On the other hand, the KGB was an agency which operated during relatively peaceful time for the Soviet Union. Invasions didn't affect the modus operandi of the KGB. So there were no big structural changes in the KGB because, say, of the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968 or the war in Afghanistan in the 1980s. But now the country is at war, so the FSB massively escalated. Before the war, Russian opposition politicians were never accused of high treason, of being traitors. And now we have Vladimir Kara-Murza being accused of exactly that. Before the war, there were several repressive options for the opposition politicians. Now, just one, prison. Before the war, lawyers were never arrested. And now we have Dmitry Talantov, a human rights lawyer who worked on the FSB cases trying to defend people. And now he's in jail for spreading fake news about the war. And this list is going on and on. The FSB became much more aggressive towards journalists. Well, here I can cite from my own experience. In March, the Internal Security Department of the FSB initiated a criminal case against me on charges of spreading fake news about the war. But it was because of our reporting of Sergei Besieda. It's not the first time the FSB investigates me, but it's quite unpleasant. I face up to 10 years in prison if I get back. My bank accounts in Russia have been frozen, my car was arrested, and the Russian government put me on the wanted list, which means that I cannot travel to several countries. Well, still thanks to this criminal investigation, we found a way how to use it to get some information about what's going on. So, for instance, when in December I got a copy of my criminal file, I found a very touching note of the chief investigator. I'm citing, "The investigation failed to obtain information from the FSB that would refute Soldatov's and Barakan's arguments." I take this as a sign of recognition. And of course, I'm not the only Russian journalist on the wanted list. This list is getting bigger by almost every week. And we all understand why they are doing that. Most of us are already in exile out of the country, but we still have our relatives, we have our parents, we have friends, and this means more pressure on them and on us. Well, even mainstream sectors of the Russian economy came under FSB pressure. For instance, take Russia's national healthcare system. Since June, the Russian Financial Monitoring Agency, together with the FSB, has investigated medical clinics across the country for prescribing Western medicine rather than Russian ones. And the campaign was presented to the public as cracking down on schemes by foreign pharmaceutical companies that sell their drugs through Russian doctors. Sounds familiar for those who researched the Soviet history after the Second World War. But the most striking development, of course, concerns the FSB's tactics in Ukraine. Before the war, the FSB's role, the field service of Besieda, was mostly limited to recruitment of Ukrainian politicians, penetration of Ukrainian government organizations. But now the agency is running a massive operation to detain large numbers of Ukrainians in Russia and in the occupied territories of Ukraine. And I'm talking about the infamous filtration camps. And I probably should mention that the filtration camps were used extensively by Stalin's secret services during the Second World War. And here, the FSB is just practical. The main objective of those camps is not to imprison, but to recruit. The more people you process in those camps, the more assets you might recruit. And it makes things more difficult for the Ukrainian counterintelligence to detect. Also, if you're recruiting a camp, you have the biggest leverage. You can apply all kinds of pressure, physical or psychological, on these people. So for the Russians, it is a way to rebuild their agents' networks in Ukraine. Unfortunately, Ukrainians are detained not only in the filtration camps. The Leforto prison, under control of the FSB, as I already said, has lots of Ukrainian prisoners as we speak. A few words about the mood in the services. To be honest, there was never a lot of enthusiasm about the invasion in the FSB. For instance, my contacts at the Economic Security Service told me in April and May that they had been surprised, having never asked to provide any assessment of the toll the Western sanctions might have on the economy. A month later, they told me they were quite happy, nobody asked them, because now they couldn't be held responsible. In April, they still questioned why Putin decided to invade. But by the summer, they focused on small tactical questions. They ceased to ask this big question, why to start the war? They accepted that the war was inevitable. Still, the summer was a very confusing time, but in the fall, the mood began to change dramatically. Special forces and the FSB operatives were getting religious and apocalyptic. And I think the reason was the humiliation Russia suffered when Russian troops abandoned Kherson. And suddenly our contacts started sending us via social media images of religious icons, prayers for the victory of the Russian army, and calls to pray for soldiers on the battlefield. And we've known most of our contacts in Russian special forces for many years, and none of them were extremely religious before the war. A wave of mysticism has descended on them. I think this new development reflects a demand for some kind of guidance in a very confusing war. Unfortunately, the church is only happy to justify the war provided because, since there is no clarity with the official aims of the war provided by the Kremlin, and the more primitive and mystical it is, the better. All of that is not extremely optimistic, and there are two things I wanted to point out in particular. First, Stalinization of Russia's security services means bad news for the Russians in the country, for sure, but also it's a really bad news for the Russians abroad. Stalin was obsessed with political immigration and exiles. Putin inherited that obsession, and just like his Soviet predecessors, he always dismisses the political emigres as completely irrelevant, but constantly tasks more and more departments inside the Russian intelligence agencies to address the challenge posed by emigres. And now all three Russian intelligence agencies, the FSB, the SVR, and the military intelligence, trying to deal with the problem posed by the Russian immigration. I think the reason is the same feeling of insecurity I was talking about before. At the Lubyanka Square, there is a strong belief that in 1917, the mighty Russian Empire was taken down by a bunch of emigrant revolutionaries who returned to the country. So why another group of exiles, that theory goes, will not try the same thing if only given a chance? Since May 2022, the FSB has been visiting the families of Russian exiles to convey the message that the Russian government is ready to welcome the exiles back. And there were also some reports that when some Russian IT specialists decided to get back, they were summoned to the FSB and interrogated. But it was still a relatively small effort. In January, it changed. Now we see a significant escalation. The Kremlin is developing a strategy to deal with this new wave of immigration as we speak. The approach is very straightforward: to lure back to Russia those who are important for Russia's survival and for the Russians' war effort, and here we talk mostly about the IT specialists, and to silence those who are politically active. And, and this is something we need to keep in mind. Russians in exile who stand up against the war have now targets on their backs, more than ever. You might ask me, is there any hope? Well, 2023 is going to be dark for Russia. Most of those who could leave already left. Those who cannot, and I mean the thinking part of the society, what is left there, well, we'll try to find a way to adjust to the circumstances when even your children are subject to compulsive propaganda at school. And the way to live in such circumstances is to switch to a survival strategy, something very familiar to those Russians who remember the Soviet Union, to make an exodus, domestic life, quiet conversations, kitchens, to a habit of being cautious, what you say on the phone or in social media. In short, to keep one's head down. Add to that the feeling of isolation. And I think this combination is probably what the Germans might have felt during the First World War. But there is a difference, and I think it is huge. There is a connection to the global world for the Russians who want to know the truth. And this connection via the internet is alive thanks to Russian journalists in exile. Russian journalists and Russian media in exile have an audience of millions in the country. We know that. There are millions out there who are not happy with what Putin is doing in Ukraine and in Russia. And that gives me hope. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. So Andre, thank you for being here. Fantastic talk. Thank you for being here. Fantastic talk. Great way to honor Alex Dahl, my former advisor, by the way, was an undergraduate. I have 17 questions. Can I ask them? How about two? How about two? He said one, then I'm going to make it A and B. So tell us a little bit more. You hinted at it, but I want you to go in a little bit more detail about intelligence presented to Putin during the decision-making to invade Ukraine. You focused on the 5th Directorate of the FSB. I thank you. I've read lots of what you've written. I think many people didn't know about this organization before. But there are other groups that you also mentioned, the SVR, GRU. By the way, there's even something called, the Foreign Ministry. Tell me what you think they were saying in their reporting. And was Putin seeing this different reporting as he was going in, or was he just leaning on Besieda and Mordikov because of these relationships he had, right? I'm interested in that question. And then related to that, and I'll leave the questions about the militarization, and I'm interested in, if I get another chance, I'll ask that about what's going on in the world now, but in the decision-making with the generals themselves, right? Gerasimov is seeing this intelligence. Is he agreeing with it? Is he nervous about it? You kind of hinted that there was not an enthusiasm. How does he feel about it now after 200,000 casualties based on this intelligence? Could you tell us, because that's not the intelligence part. Those are the implementers of the decision. How do they feel at the beginning, and then how do they feel now about, in other words, did the FSB dupe them into this catastrophic war that they are now entangling? So one, what was he seeing beforehand from the other groups that were gathering intelligence? And two, relationship between intelligence officers and the generals themselves.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I wish I knew everything you asked me about. Well, because of course I'm outsider, I'm not an insider. I'm not a close friend to Putin. But what we know is it looks like the SVR and the military intelligence, they're not trusted to help with the preparation of the invasion. We know that, and how we know that? For instance, when the invasion started, for 2 weeks, the hacking operation of the military intelligence just stopped. And the only explanation is that these people were not in the know what was coming, and they got completely confused. We get the same information about the SVR, but many people inside were not briefed and they're not told what is coming. I know that not even every department of the FSB was in the know. So it looks like Putin decided to limit access to this information to just a few people. Bortnikov, Patrushev, Iseda, maybe two or three people more, but that was it. How they took it when the invasion started, and it was a disaster. Again, it's strange evidence, but maybe it helps. When the invasion started, and of course I started giving my comments, and of course I thought that probably I can lose some sources inside of these agencies because of my anti-war stand. Surprisingly, I got contacted by the military intelligence almost immediately. And what they told me, that they were absolutely unhappy with the FSB. They blamed the FSB, which means that the rivalry between agencies is still there, and they decided to blame the FSB in what actually happened with the military planning. So they pretended that there was no military planning, it was all political operation planned by Putin and his people, and if the military would have a say, of course, everything would be much, much better. How they think about this operation now? Well, unfortunately, what is going on fits with some stereotypes the Russian army always has had. And this is the idea that the West is always against us, and because now it's not, well, it would be too humiliating to admit that actually they are losing to Ukrainians. So for them, it's a big war with NATO. And that means that, first of all, they tried to say to themselves that it was completely inevitable. So they just forget about the question. Maybe it was not a really good thing to start it. And second, now they think that the big problem now is that they lost the only advantage the Russian army had in the case of a big military conflict with NATO. And this advantage is that the cost of life in Russia and in the West is different. So the Russians might sustain more casualties than, say, NATO army, if we are talking about France or Germany or the UK or even the United States. But now we are not fighting with NATO armies, right? We are fighting in Ukraine. It is Ukrainians who are suffering these casualties. So the only advantage the Russians thought they could have, they lost it. And that makes them extremely depressed. And that's probably the reason why they're getting more and more religious. I'm talking not only about, say, lieutenants and majors, I'm talking about people even high.
Yes.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. My question is about differences or similarities between 2014 and 2022. You said that this enemy threat Maidan, but nonetheless, the assessment of the capabilities of Ukraine to resist was certainly more adequate then, and the match between what Russians were trying to do and what people were deployed to do it and the Ukrainian ability to resist was both in Crimea and in Donbass was certainly much better than this time around. They have done no assessment in 2022. This assessment was not listened to. It was done by some other intelligence services. What's happened? What's the difference?
Well, as I said, they focused on problems in the Ukrainian military and Ukrainian government organizations. So they focused all their attention on corruption, and basically that was the message. Like, the state is still extremely weak because of corruption. So if they attack, it would just collapse. That was the idea. And that is why it was so important that they completely, decided to disregard what was going on in Ukrainian society, because for Putin, it's this idea, you cannot sell it to him. He never accepted the idea that the society might have a role. If you listen to his conversations, especially his interviews, when he talked about Ukraine and about Maidan, it's quite interesting that he always referred to some kind of agreement he had with leaders. So for him, the politics, basically it's about leaders. So you have an agreement with Churchill or Roosevelt, but you don't need to think about their societies. The same thing about Maidan. He believed, and he still believes, that he was betrayed because he had an agreement to save Yanukovych. But then there's some people on the streets, they decided that they didn't want to have him. And because he doesn't understand this idea of this, that the society might actually have a say, he feels betrayed by the leaders. And I think that never changed with him. From since 2014, he still has the same idea. And as I tried to show you, he's making the same mistake over and over again.
Oh, sure. I want to ask you, sorry, I think I'm too, right? Thank you. It was really interesting talk, and I think gave us a lot to think about with the role of the intelligence services. I wanted to ask you about Wagner and Prigozhin, and whether whether Wagner is really a creature of military intelligence, as opposed to Prigozhin alone, and what their relationship is, and if that's the case, then why is he now trying this sort of public funding pitch to get ammunition and supplies to Wagner, because the Ministry of Defense doesn't want to give it to them, understandably.
Well, first of all, what we need to understand about Prigozhin, that some people say, well, he might be thinking of his own political career. Look, this guy doesn't have any political backing from anyone. He doesn't have any financial resources, completely independent from the Kremlin. Everything he got is provided by the Kremlin or the military, the Ministry of Defense. As far as I know from my sources, already in 2015, there was a special section established in the military intelligence to supervise private military companies, specifically Wagner. So it is still supervised by the military intelligence. What he's trying to do, and I think it's quite smart of him, is he understands that now it is his moment, and what he lacks recognition within Russian bureaucracy. So I think his idea is something like the position of the deputy head of the Security Council. And we have a precedent. We have Boris Berezovsky, who had no military training, was a very interesting guy, and nevertheless, he got this position because, well, some people believed he might be helpful. Dealing with Chechnya and some other problems.
Prigozhin doesn't have that position.
No, and I think that is why he's so active. He's trying to attract attention to himself, basically saying, well, I'm so useful for you, please give me some recognition, give me some space, give me some position. I think that position might be a position in the Security Council. Well, at least it makes some sense.
Thank you for a terrific talk. I wanted to ask you about your take on Putin's on-again, off-again flirt with nuclear brinkmanship or nuclear threats. And there are a few narratives that give you reporting or explanations. One is that the West managed to determine there's signals. The other is that it's operationally just not relevant for any tactical mean he would like to get, or maybe a combination of both, or something else psychological. Your take on this would be appreciated.
It is a very interesting question, and I think maybe the answer is, if you look at the bigger picture, Putin actually, when the war started, the invasion started, and then he understood that it's not going really well for him. In the beginning, and I would say also in the summer, he tried several very drastic measures. Not only the nuclear, but for instance, he had the State Duma preparing for him the nationalization bill. So the idea was that, look, if all these foreign companies leave the country, we can get a huge crisis of unemployment, so we can get massive layoffs, and that could start a big social unrest in Russian regions, and it would be really bad for the country and for the war effort. It never happened. The bill was never approved. Again, I think when he finds himself in a really difficult situation, he's trying for these drastic measures, and then he makes a step back, because he still believes that he has control of the situation. I think the very difficult moment was probably September, October, and everybody started talking, look, he might try nuclear, especially because, well, he had this perfect target for that, Mariupol and Azov. But well, instead he decided to go conventional. So he started his mobilization, and it was much more conventional. It was, it was horrible, but still, it's conventional. And I think now, maybe, I hope that this threat is not that big, because for him, the war is going, I would say now they think it's getting better. First of all, because the political stability is still there, so fine for him. There is no resistance. He found a way how to actually to boost his military industrial complex, and the economy was not destroyed, right? He has a big army ready to do something, and even if he gets all these casualties, again, there's no problem with the population. So for him, the situation seems to be, well, kind of under control. And I hope, I cannot read his mind, but I hope that that is why he might try to limit his actions with conventional means. But of course, part of the strategy is to try to prevent the West from, say, responding to his future offensive. And the way to do that is to say, look, we might start some big operation, please do not try to do anything funny, because in this case, I might escalate. I think he's always doing that.
Thank you for the very interesting talk. I was wondering whether you could touch on the relationship between KGB and FSO, and in particular whether the FSO was also put under Berioza's thumb.
Well, as we know that Vladimir Putin has two security services to protect his body. So you have the FSO, the Federal Protection Service, but also you have the service to protect the president, which is part of the FSO, but almost completely independent. This agency was extremely important in the 2000s and the 1990s, but I would say that now the role of this agency is quite limited. But what this agency is still capable of is to give Putin people who might be appointed to some sensitive positions. And we know that the FSO was, because he knows these people personally, and he has a big problem. In the early 2000s, he appointed to prominent positions people he personally knew, right? And these people were from the FSB, mostly from St. Petersburg. But now he lost touch with these people, right? He knows nothing in the present day department of the FSB in St. Petersburg. So where to get your people to appoint them to important positions? The only way to do that is to appoint someone you know personally, and it means your bodyguards. He tried that several times, and we have several people who were given really important positions. But again, now it seems that he decided to rely more on the FSB than the FSO. For instance, the guy I mentioned, Roman Gavrilov, the deputy head of the National Guard, who was forced into retirement, he was a bodyguard to Putin. Nevertheless, Putin got rid of him.
Thank you, Andrei, for a very interesting talk. And the question I wanted to ask has to do with this issue you mentioned in your talk, but also in your writing, that the FSB is becoming more like the NKVD than like the KGB, and taking over certain functions and in some senses modeling itself more after NKVD. I wonder about Putin himself and Stalin. I mean, it's one of those large historical questions, but is he himself kind of rehabilitating Stalin in his own mind and in society, meaning, slowly, drip, 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 the image of Stalin and Stalinism might be coming back.
Well, this is a question we asked ourselves so many times. Well, to be honest, I think that Putin still is not completely happy with Stalin. And for instance, he failed to remain Volgograd in Stalingrad. So it's always seems to be halfway tactics. So he went to Volgograd, he allowed them to erect a monument to Stalin, but he decided not to rename the city. And it's not only about the city. For instance, when the Soviet Union was at war, all Soviet ministers were in uniforms, right? They were all military all of a sudden, even if they were completely, they liked all military training. Nevertheless, all of a sudden you got a country completely uniform. It's not what is going on right now. Yes, Putin decided to address the nation before the new year, surrounded by soldiers, but he was in a suit. If you check the footage of the Coordination Council on Military Supply, again, all these people, except Shoigu and Zolotov, were in suits. Well, I mean, Portnikov has a military rank. He might easily wear a uniform and present himself as a military leader, but they are not doing this. So I think there's still some restraints for Putin. He doesn't want to go this way. And also, last week he mentioned that they managed somehow to avoid the complete militarization of the economy. So it seems that he has this in mind, and he still didn't want to do that. But I mean, I think there's a way things escalate, and you cannot control it forever.
We'll go.
Thank you for the very interesting presentation. My question is, what is acceptable endgame for Putin and his entourage?
I don't see any way out for Putin, to be honest. That's my problem. I think that's why it's so horrible, because the Russian society is getting more and more used to this war. It became an accepted thing. At the same time, Putin he found a way how to mobilize the society, not to mobilize it. For instance, if you are in big cities like Moscow, St. Petersburg, there are still some limits on war propaganda. So if you want to pretend that there is no war, there's a way for you to pretend that there is no war. And I think, at least now, Putin thinks that he found this fine balance between mobilization and ignorance of the Russian population. And unfortunately, he is preparing the country for a very long war. My biggest fear, we might end up with something like Iran-Iraq war. My last 3 years.
Thank you very much for the talk. I'd like to follow up a little bit more on the remarks you made about the army and its kind of adjustment to the situation, especially among the officer corps of senior officers. Because if you look at it, the KGB or NKVD were the traditional rivals or indeed enemies of the military. The military planning or the planning of this operation was done by the FSB. The military were put in an impossible position. And you have the Wagner group and you have Kadyrov and his people. So somehow the army is taking the hit for the war and has so far suffered quite badly, while other institutions seem to be more powerful or led to exist in a way that constrains the army. So I'm just wondering how far, you mentioned kind of trying to religion, fighting for Holy Russia, how far that really blocks out these other political elements in the situation. I mean, if you're in the general staff, don't you feel extremely unhappy about the situation you're put in? Or if you just say, well, we're soldiers, we do what we're told to do.
Yes, there are lots of people in the general staff, as far as I know from the conversation I had, which were extremely surprised by the way the war is going, and they're really unhappy. But at the same time, what we need to understand that Russia is not like Syria or Iraq or Turkey. They never had any underground movements in the Russian army. The last time the Russian army tried coup d'etat was probably 1825, and it was a disaster. Well, the Russian army is penetrated by the FSB. We had a story some months ago, or maybe it was just before the war, about a small aerodrome, military aerodrome in central Russia. They had only 6 planes, 6 helicopters. And they got a document about the FSB requirements, how many agents they needed to have to supervise this small aerodrome. 22. Think about it. And they needed some secret apartments to meet the agents. They needed to have a head of the station. I mean, it's crazy. This penetration is really big. And in the society where nobody trusts nobody, it's a problem. In the FSB, on the other hand, there is also a problem of trust. The middle level officers, they do not trust the generals do not trust the officers. And actually, if you look at the way the Russian military exists and the Russian security services exist, they're not like the Egyptian army. So they failed to build this clientele, distributing money. It's not like that. It's all about the positions, which means that if you want to start thinking about building an organization to, I don't know, to plot against Putin, you don't know where to start. You don't have this experience and you don't trust anyone.
My question is in the area of the extent to which the FSB is involved in culture. And specifically, is the volume okay? Specifically, on March 1 of last year, the senior staff, I think all the professionals of the Hermitage, were placed on furlough. And some, if not all, were off for 6 months without pay. So it says something about budget and anticipation and the fact that now tourism is down 95% to Russia. But the talk now is about the fact that the professional head of the Tretyakov Gallery was, as you undoubtedly know, was replaced by someone with absolutely no art history background. I'm just curious, not about the facts of the case so much as what that reflects about FSB involvement.
Yeah, I think that it is a very big effort by the FSB, and it started almost 20 years ago. I remember 20 years ago, 2002, I had a contact inside of the FSB, and he was in charge of counterterrorism. And all of a sudden, he was appointed, he was assigned to Shukinsky University, a theater school. And he got completely confused because he didn't know what to do. And finally, he secured a meeting with the director. And after that, we had a meeting with him. And he went to this meeting and said, "Look, Andrew, now I know what to do." And I asked him, "Okay, so what?" He said, "Well, I think I would be fighting drugs." And I was extremely confused, like, why drugs? Well, because when I was waiting for this guy, for this director in the corridor, I spotted some young people and they were making some strange moves. And I said, well, they are actors. What do you expect it? So these people are not extremely prepared for this task about 20 years past. And the problem is that now you have a special big department in the FSB for protection of the Constitution. And inside you have what is very similar to what the fifth department of the KGB used to do, supervising the Russian intelligentsia and most of all theaters and universities and attaching their people. And they have some strange ideas about why they need to do that. And again, they're using some Soviet experience once again. Something about Western influence, where we need to deal with this problem. They found some effective ways to do that. For instance, if you go to the conference now, and it started before the war, you need to collect 7 signatures if you are with the university, which means signatures that you are allowed to go to the conference. And that means that when you are getting back, you need to report. And you need to report about the meetings you had, what kind of people you met, very Soviet approach. And that, of course, had a big effect on many, especially in academia. And it also goes for state-sponsored theaters, because it's all state-sponsored.